Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring religious imagery. The Fool by David Mason. Messenger by Joseph Samachson. And It Was Good by A. Early. The Sons of Japheth by Richard Wilson. Mr. Andrews by E. M. Forster.
The Fool by David Mason, originally published in Infinity Science Fiction, August 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The Tarchiki were the universe's worst pupils, and as a teacher, Duncan was a first-rate carpenter. Duncan, now he wasn't the agent just before you. He was here in 2180. Oh, a good 30 years back, Earth time. The natives say hundreds of years, but they're a short-lived lot. The way they cut each other throats, it's a wonder any of them live out the lifespan they've got anyway. I came out when Duncan did. Knew him pretty well as anybody could. A perfect fool. Knowing him was a real education. Do anything the other way from the way Duncan did it, and you'd be all right. You wouldn't think it to look at him. Well set-up man, around 30 when he got here. Intelligent face, good talker. Had a degree, but a fool. Seemed as if he couldn't do anything right. He told me once that he'd been married, and that it had broken up. He more or less implied that his wife had gotten sick of little things, broken dishes, tactless remarks, carelessness. You wouldn't think that would be enough to break up a marriage, but you've got no idea how that sort of thing can add up. I was clerking from him then. I swear I did all the work. I had to. He couldn't add, he couldn't file a record, and couldn't have found one if he had managed somehow to put it away. I took agents' inventories. I did most of the trading with the native chiefs. I did everything. Duncan just bumbled around the post, or listened to records, or wrote those silly, hopeless letters to his ex-wife. He was trying to get her to come back to him. How do I know? Well, who do you think worked the subspace transmitter, as well as doing everything else? The native thing really annoyed me, though, because it was dangerous. You know the Tarchiki. They look human enough, except for minor details. When it comes to a Tarchik female, I'll overlook the green skin and the pointed ears every time. But they aren't entirely like us. They have a liking for war and torture that's really sickening. Our ancestors, oh now really, you're talking just like Duncan. That was always his apology for them. He said our own ancestors were pretty bad too. Certainly they were, but I can't see any ancestor of mine acting the way a Tarchik does with a captured enemy. And they haven't the slightest sense of sportsmanship either. They'd rather jump you from ambush than fight in the open, and they won't fight at all if the enemy's stronger than they are. That's why they've never made any serious attempt to do in all the Earthmen on their world. That and greed. They get very good deals from us, and they know it. Anyway, I'm sure none of my ancestors ever acted like that. But Duncan was always ready to forgive a Tarchik anything. That used to upset the hell out of them, too, because they expect to be punished when they're caught at anything. They don't understand our reluctance to kill, but they respect a patrolman's shotgun, and when they get caught stealing or taking each other's tails, they know they're going to get a few months in quad, or what they hate much worse, a public flogging. If they didn't get punished, they'd assume it was weakness on our part, just like kids. Anyway, there was Duncan, holding long confabs with the Tarchiki, trying to teach them some sort of elementary ethics. Naturally, it didn't take at all. They listened because they love long speeches, but they never acted on what he said. He used to tell them that if they stopped chopping each other up and hanging up the rows of tails as war trophies, their lives would be a lot pleasanter. They used to nod and applaud, but Duncan never caught on to the simple fact that they thought this was meant to be a joke. They didn't think their lives weren't pleasant enough. After all, look at their situation. They got plenty to eat without working hard for it, plenty of time on their hands. Why shouldn't they keep down their surplus population? They don't know any other way, except breaking up their eggs, and they only do that to enemy tribes. While he was at it, Duncan tried to tell them all about love and things like that. Oh no, not sex. If there's anything a Tarchik doesn't know about that, there's no Earthman going to teach him. I mean, the way they treat their women. A Tarchik's women nothing but a piece of property as far as sex goes, but there's some kind of curious maternal inheritance thing. Anyway, it's as funny as hell to see a big Tarchik buck get down and bump his head in front of his mother and his aunts and all his other female ancestors. That's the one thing he's really afraid of. But till she gets to be a mother, a woman leads a fairly rough life, getting passed around as a kind of prize of war, working harder than the men, all that. So Duncan wanted them to be a bit chivalrous to their women, share the work, all kinds of things like that. You know what they thought of that idea. Another Earthman's joke. But the funniest thing of all, to them, was his idea about the kids. Naturally, a Tarchik pup's no use to its father till it's a bit grown. Then, if it's a boy, the old man teaches it to drink smussy and file its teeth, and go out ambushing and cutting tails with the other noble savages. If it's a girl, the father looks around for a suitable buyer as soon as its breasts are grown, and hopes for the best price possible. To the mothers, though, the kids represent a kind of investment, since custom directs the first loyalties to the mother's clan. So they treat them pretty well, although a bit casually, since they litter by twos and at least once a year. Anyway, Duncan seemed to think highly of kids. Can't imagine why, since he never had any of his own. He used to run a kind of school for them, taught them all kind of things that Tarchiks got no use for at all, made toys for them, badly naturally. He couldn't have cut his initials in a tree without slicing his thumb. But what he couldn't make in the way of school stuff, he imported from Earth. Cost him his entire salary, except for what he spent on those futile letters to his wife. Those kids were fond of him, I suppose, as fond of him as a Tarchik ever gets of anything. They even kept the school foolishness going a while afterward, but I think it's gone now. Anything that fool Duncan said, the Tarchiki thought was a great joke. They wouldn't have hurt his feelings for anything, for fear he'd quit telling them tall stories. They told him quite a few things too. He wrote it all down, in dead earnest, as if their fairy tales and drum poems had any value. I sent the whole lot off to his wife after it happened. I think it got lost in transit. I never heard from her anyway, or she may have thrown it all away. I can't imagine what else you could do with such a pile of nonsense. As a matter of fact, that's what led up to it, those damned legends. Duncan got interested in their religion. Never do that, boy. Let 'em all have their ghost stories and wooden gods, and never fool around with their idea of what makes the planet go round. The Tarchiks have a lot of small time fetishes, but they also have one big god, a fat one made out of stone, out in the jungle over near Mount Clark. Every so often they all go up in a body and pay him a visit, and they take along any spare pups, usually extra girl children or prisoners from other tribes. This god, Kachan his name is, I think, likes children too. He likes them best roasted, like birds on a spit. Charming deity. Anyway, when Duncan found out about Kachan, he got very upset. He went blazing out there to Mount Clark, and he blew Kachan all to bits with a grenade. The Tarchiki didn't care for that, naturally. About a week later, Duncan was on his way over to the big village near here to give his Tarchik kids another arithmetic lesson, I suppose. Old Stancha, he was the local religious big shot, a kind of high priest, threw a spear from the bushes, Tarchik fashion, and nailed Duncan very neatly. Nailed, yes. That's the way we found him, with his back against a tree. Just another case of a man's foolishness catching up with him. But Duncan hasn't stopped giving us trouble yet, dead or not. First thing that happened was that old Stancha came into the post, demanding to be executed. He claimed he'd made a big mistake killing Duncan, the biggest mistake of his life. I never could figure out what he meant. It seemed to have something to do with what Duncan said to him just before he died. Well, if Stancher had kept his mouth shut, we'd have no case at all, which would have been just fine with me. I was agent in Duncan's place, and I was out to see to it that business stayed good and got better. Can't annoy the natives by executing their high priest and expect good trade. But I couldn't very well let Stancher go either, once he'd confessed. So I had him tried, all proper and correct, and executed him in due form. Next thing I knew, the Tarchiks were putting Kachin back together again. They were all up there, pulling a great big new version and having a first-class party at the same time. These parties generally lead to a tail-hunting expedition, so I expected some trouble. But it didn't this time. There was plenty of noise, though. The Tarchiki never do anything quietly, and this seemed to be an occasion. What with drums, bagpipes, wailing and howling, there wasn't a bird would roost for 20 miles around. When they got all through, I went up to look over the new statue, out of curiosity, and because I'd heard that they hadn't sacrificed a single pup. I thought there must be something queer about Kachin number 2. There was. It was Duncan. They'd given him a tail, and he looked more like a Tarchik than an Earthman, but the face was unmistakable. They aren't half-bad carvers, you know, and they'd really spread themselves this time. The thing was 40 feet tall, and it stood on a rock platform, with some words carved in that lettering Duncan had taught them to use. The words were something Duncan was supposed to have said as he was dying. I never could read that stuff really well. All I got out of the thing was that Duncan was forgiving the old murderer because he didn't know what he was doing. Pure nonsense, of course, but you don't expect a dying man to make sense, and particularly not Duncan. But it seems those words were what had caused all the to-do. I found the story in one of those ballads Duncan had collected. Seems that the Tarchiki had been expecting a great teacher to show up, who'd do all sorts of wonderful things for them. Nothing unusual, all primitives as some story like that. But there was something else. The idea was that if the Tarchiki listened to this teacher, he'd make them the most important people in the whole world, in the universe, in fact, from the way the thing sounded. Just how wasn't specified. But if they should let him be killed, they would know who he had been because of his last words forgiving them. Naturally, they fitted Duncan right in. Forgiving anybody would be the least likely idea in any Tarchik's mind if he was being speared. So the Tarchiki think they'd made a terrible mistake, and they seem bent on spending the rest of time making up for it. It's the leading religion now, and it's the biggest joke I've ever come across. Poor Duncan, wrong-headed as he was about nearly everything else, had a bit of sense in that department. He never had any religious nonsense in him. Anyway, it shows you, doesn't it? I've always said you can learn a little from practically anything. You keep Duncan in mind any time you get to feeling too soft on these natives. He might be a god to these Tarchiki, but I'll tell you the real test of whether a man's got any sense. He's dead, I'm alive, and you're alive. That's enough proof for me.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Messenger by Joseph Samachson, writing as William Morrison, originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, July 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. He knew that there had been trouble, and he had been told what he had to do. The trouble was he had forgotten. He didn't remember where it was. He had been speeding past an off-colour white dwarf when it happened. If he had taken the trouble to look around, he would have seen that the white star was going to explode. He knew a potential nova when he took a good look at one. But after all these centuries he had grown careless, and when the blast had come, the small star suddenly blazing into a billion-fold brilliance, the penetrating radiation had hit him with full intensity. There had been no ship to protect him, no clothing that might serve as a shield. His kind had done away with such things eons before, as they had learned to move through space by using some of the radiant energy that filled it. He had blacked out completely. When he came to again, he was far past the nova, in the dazzling brightness of a rarefied cloud of radiant hydrogen atoms. The nova itself had lost so much of its momentary brilliance that it was now indistinguishable from the myriads of other stars. He himself was speeding on with feverish haste towards a nebula cluster 1,000 light-years away. He slowed down. He had the feeling that the distant cluster was not his proper destination. But what was? What star, what planet was the spot in space he had to find? And what was he supposed to do once he got there? And who had given him the instructions? Where, in the vast immensity of the universe, was the place called home, the place where he could return for the information he had forgotten? He didn't recall. He knew only, with the same distressing vagueness, that somewhere there was something he had been ordered to do, and that once given, the order had to be carried out. He travelled aimlessly, by feeling alone. Time meant nothing to him as an individual, for his kind had long mastered the problems of age. But time meant much to those he had been sent to. To do what? Was it to help? They must be waiting for him now. They must be wondering why he didn't come. He would have to hurry. Hurry to do something he didn't yet suspect, but would sooner or later remember. After a few centuries, he began, in his anxiety, to talk to himself, as is the way of individuals too long alone. That star cluster there could be it, he said to himself hopefully, and veered toward the right. Doesn't look familiar, though, he muttered. Maybe if I could get closer. He came close enough to see the thousands of stars as individuals, to pick out the satellites circling the bright disks of light, to study the pale planets themselves and their tiny sub-satellites. As he turned his attention from one to another, disappointment slowly filled him. No, this was not the place. There was nothing in the configuration of the stars, nothing in the size or position of the planets that sounded a familiar chord in his consciousness. He would have to go further, or turn back. He left the place behind him. The next time the same thing happened, he didn't have quite so much hope, and his disappointment was less keen. But it was disappointment nonetheless. Time was passing, and they must be waiting for him impatiently. After a while, the hope and the disappointment both died away almost completely. The former shrank to a tiny spark that grew dimmer and dimmer as the centuries passed. He wondered if it would ever wink out entirely. It was characteristic of him that the anxiety that caused was only for those who were waiting, expecting him hourly, and wondering why he didn't come. He had no sense of fear for himself, no feeling of despairing loneliness that might be expected to arise from being so long isolated in space. It was only that he would have liked someone to talk to, besides himself. On a fair number of planets he found animal-like creatures in different stages of development, and on a few he discovered life that was intelligent. It was with these that he had a renewed feeling of anticipation, the spark of hope glowing momentarily before it faded again. It's intelligent life I've got to find, he told himself, but where? His astronomical memory, insofar as it covered the post-nova period, was perfect, and he paid more attention to the details of star and planet configuration than he had ever done before. Gradually a star map formed in his mind, a map that covered enormous distances of space. Those places he had investigated and eliminated from consideration were slowly crossed off. It was a large needle he had to find, and his own powers were considerable, but the haystack he had to search was infinite. There was no telling how many more centuries would pass before he found it. And then another thought struck him. They'd know back home that something had gone wrong. Would they send someone else to do the job in his place? He rather doubted it. He had a vague feeling that there weren't many with his own peculiar talents. What had to be done by him, or left undone altogether. More time passed, and one day, when the space charted on his brain's map had grown to vast dimensions, and the spark of hope had become so tiny that he was not quite sure any longer that it was there at all, he noted from a distance a galaxy that seemed familiar. "That's it!" he cried. "That's it!" The spark flared, and as he sped toward the galaxy it became a flame. It was a lens-shaped assemblage of stars, with 2 small spiral arms composed of a few million stars each, and was seemingly not too different from millions of other galaxies he had passed in the course of all those centuries. But to him, seeking so desperately, this galaxy was unique. It was the right one. He coursed through it from spiral arm to spiral arm, and now there could be no doubt. The star he wanted was small and yellowish, far from the center of the lens. It had a rather elaborate planetary system, which he recognized at once. This was it, the 3rd planet, the one with a single sub-satellite, was the one he had been sent to find. To find and perhaps to help. But how? The finding of the planet had solved one problem. So far it had given him not a hint toward the solution of the second, the reason why he had been sent here. There was life on this ball of mud and water, a great deal of life, both vegetable and animal, and some of the latter could, without too great a distortion of the truth, be called intelligent. It had raised cities, tunneled into mountains, changed the appearance of sections of the planet itself. It was to this intelligent life that he had been sent. A dim memory of the need for caution kept him from letting himself be seen. "I'd only frightened them," he thought. "I'll have to investigate thoroughly before I reveal myself, and maybe the investigation will remind me of what I have to do." The first thing was to come down to Earth. Choosing the dark side of the planet, shaded from the central sun by its own bulk, he shrank his body and let himself drop in the gravitational field. From time to time he slowed his fall in order to keep from flaming through the atmosphere and attracting their attention. And at 1,000 feet above the surface he came to a complete stop, hovering over a city, and making up his mind where to land. Something droned toward him through the air, colored lights winking on and off. He darted downward and to one side. Where the city lights faded out, he let himself fall all the way to the ground. He was off a dimly lit highway. Small metal vehicles ran along it, their lights momentarily tearing apart the darkness ahead of them. A glance through the metal at the creatures inside the vehicles gave him a queer thrill. Yes, these were the ones he had been sent to. Quickly reshaping his body and clothing himself so that he seemed to be one of them, he began to walk along the highway. Cars sped past him, picking him out in their headlights. None of them stopped, but he had time to probe their minds and listen to their language. What he found was not pleasant. Among all the feelings which controlled their thoughts, fear was easiest to detect, and along with the fear were hatred and envy and greed, anxiety and guilt. Oddly enough, there were also hope and affection for each other, but it was the worst feelings that predominated. There was no doubt that they needed help. That didn't make any clearer, however, what he had to do. He had an idea that it was not his mission to work out a detailed solution. He had to do some simple thing, something. The two men were lying in wait, either for him or for some other pedestrian they judged sufficiently unwary. He sensed them long before the first one stepped out toward him, a cigarette in one hand, and what was supposed to be an ingratiating look on the brutal face. "Got a match, bud?" The other man suddenly plunged at him from the side, an arm wrapping itself around his neck. The assailant tried to bend him back, the forearm cutting across his windpipe. The arm of the first man swung, a rough fist smashing at his face. Then the two assailants screamed in pain and terror. Where they had touched him, fist and arm broke into flame. Both men turned from him in horror and ran off wildly, as if to get away from themselves. He hadn't meant to hurt them, but they had contrived their own punishment. Perhaps. No, that wasn't it. He wasn't here to punish either. He walked along, and soon he found himself entering the city. A man in a blue uniform watched him suspiciously and ordered him gruffly to get moving. "I am moving," he said pleasantly. "Don't you get wise with me," said the blue coat, and raised a threatening club. He paid no attention to the club, and kept on, toward the heart of the city. What he saw only confirmed the impression he had obtained from the minds of the men and women in the cars. Too many thoughts were mean and ignoble, rising only from selfish and vicious desires. Many of those who saw him seemed to sense his strangeness, and moved toward him with a single impulse, to take advantage of his ignorance. Men spoke to him out of the sides of their mouths, offering him bargains. Women offered themselves. "Look, Mac, this stuff is hot, see? Just came off a truck. Want to look at some nice pictures, mister? I can give you a good address, bud. Out for a good time, Jack?" The planet was sick. Had he been sent to cure it? He came to an area of broad lighted streets. Lights glittered everywhere, attracting the attention of those around him but going on and off. Great posters advertised the attractions inside places of amusement. He entered one of them, an astonished ticket collector calling after him, "Hey, where's your ticket, bud?" But there was something about him that prevented the man from pursuing. He lost himself in the darkness and watched the screen. Here, in brief and vivid form, was pictured the life of the planet. Women in bathing suits plunged into a pool and formed a pattern which imitated sensuously the petals of an unfolding rose. A small animal leaped through hoops and climbed a ladder. Groups of men drove against each other for possession of an object which they kicked occasionally into the air. An elderly man looked grim and made a speech into a microphone. And then a film showed the main business of the planet, which seemed to be the killing of its supposedly intelligent inhabitants. Bombs exploded, planes crashed, desperate lines of men ran forward to meet their deaths. Something quickened in his mind. He almost remembered now. This was what he had come here about. His will moved, and the theatre vanished behind him. Now he was on the battlefield itself. The reality was worse than the image, far worse. Here were not only the roars of the great guns, but the curses and screams of the wounded, the gasps of the dying. Here were not only horrible sights and sounds, but the odours of death, the sharp nitrogenous fragrance of explosives, the heavy sulphurous smoke of burning oil, the sickening smell of sweating or decaying flesh. A cloud came into being from the explosion of a mortar shell, and two men dropped to the ground. In answer to the mortar, the flaring barrel of a tank gun spoke hoarsely, and half the crew of the mortar fell in turn. But there seemed no end to this deadly dialogue. The next moment there came the burst of a bomb from a low-flying plane, and the tank half turned over on its side, a heap of smoking steel. He knew at last why he had been sent here. He knew now what he had to do. He ripped the flaring-mouthed gun from the tank. His hands twisted the thick metal into a shape it had never known before, bent it into a strange curve, fashioned it so that it would emit overtones to chill the souls of those who heard it. His brain charged the instrument with the energy of his own mind, energy that would send his voice to the far corners of this diseased planet, and leave not a single individual deaf to its dreaded tones. Putting the improvised horn to his lips, Gabriel blew the call for which the planet had so long been waiting.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
And It Was Good by A. Early. Originally published in Amazing Stories, February 1962. Narrated by Tom Trussel. When she came back, he looked at her and put down the piece of wood which he had been carving. He always carved in anxious moments. Many years before, he had been apprenticed to a carpenter. He still loved the smooth, creamy feel and the warm tang of a good piece of wood. Usually he whittled away at it until it suggested a design to work on. More often than not, it turned out to be a face, rugged peasant features with the simple wisdom of age engraved on them, or the chubby walls of a child dimpled with delight. Today, he thought, it might make a tree heavy with fruit and the crown of leaves. "He's decided to do it then," he said, and she nodded without looking at him. She did not want to see the pain in her son's eyes. He got up and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "When?" he asked her softly, patiently. "Right away." "Did you ask him if he would let me go again instead?" "I couldn't," she said, and pulled him to her. "I couldn't bear it again after what they did to you last time." "Am I any the worse for it?" He smiled at her. "Besides, it was a long time ago and people have changed." "You'd suffer and you'd be away for years," she said. "I couldn't go through that. Not again." "Is he very sad about it?" he asked. "You know how he is when he has to do a thing like that," she said. "He said you weren't to worry too much. I was to tell you he'd like to talk to you about it later. He might want you to go there for a short visit while it's on." He went back to his whittling, but his mind was busy with other things, and the tree would not take shape. Spring had been late before. As the Times pointed out, there had been snow as late as mid-May in 1569 and at the end of April in 1782. Yet the chronicles recorded bumper crops for both years. Agricultural experts advised closer pruning of fruit trees to speed budding, and an American firm of artificial fertilizer manufacturers brought out a new product called Shoot Boost. But the correspondence columns of the newspapers carried letters pointing out that, while spring might have been late before, this time the weather was entirely spring-like, yet still there was no sign of shoot, blossom, or bud. Excessive radiation resulting from nuclear tests was blamed. It was mid-May before the people and their governments became seriously alarmed. Trees still stood bare as in the depth of winter. Lawns bore the bruising of last season's mowing, but no new growth. Flower beds showed the unbroken rills of after-seed raking. Farmers walked their fields day after day and crouched down to silhouette the furrows against the sky, the better to see the green whiskers when they sprouted. They prodded the heifers and ewes, and went down to the villages to consult the vet. The wives searched the hen houses and put down extra grain and bricks of chalk. The Pope's call to worldwide prayer and the British government's announcement of the introduction of rationing fell on the same day. In most countries, The Pope's call found little response because the people were too busy lining up at food stores trying to lay in stocks. There were bread riots in Tehran. Rumours of a cattle disease began to circulate several days before official news of the full extent of the additional catastrophe was released. That night, the British Prime Minister spoke on the BBC. "With Her Majesty's consent," he said after reviewing the grave and disquieting situation, "I have given instructions for all available ships of the Royal Navy to put to sea immediately as an emergency fishing fleet." Meanwhile, he continued, divers and frogmen were asked to place their services at the disposal of the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries. They would be required to glean nourishment for the nation from the laden larders of the deep. "Human ingenuity, skill, and tenacity will conquer yet," he concluded. The Prime Minister's broadcast was followed by the announcement of emergency regulations for the disposal of dead cattle. On 16th of June, the President of the United States informed an emergency meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations that Professor Braunweiler of Columbia University had perfected a method of extracting carbon sugar from wood. All suitable industrial plants throughout America were to be geared to the mass production of the necessary equipment. The United States was prepared to supply the whole world with this equipment and with power-operated tree-felling implements on a lend-lease basis. Teams of instructors in the use of the equipment would be available to proceed to all parts of the world by the end of the month. The offer, which became known as USA Sugar Aid to the World, was accepted with gratitude by all but the Soviet delegation. Shortly after sugar aid started, a Frenchman named Dr. Muller discovered, in desperation, vineyards too barren, that tree sugar caused a fermentation in the still plentiful needles of coniferous trees which, when distilled, resulted in a drink rich in alcohol and vitamins. He gave the drink the name Boignac, in melancholy memory of happier days. Within 6 weeks, France had a surplus in the World Bank, and a French admiral was appointed to command the NATO Mediterranean fleet. Undoubtedly, Boignac helped. Yet, by the end of August, even that could not arrest the death rate. On 3rd of September, a Soviet task force landed troops and armor at 16 places along the East African coast. Moscow radio informed the world that the glorious forces of the USSR have taken this step under the personal command of Mr. Khrushchev to safeguard Africa's rich resources in animal life against the depredations of the capitalist warmongers. Thus, the world was told, all peace-loving peoples would be assured an equitable and adequate supply of meat in the hard months to come. At an emergency meeting of the NATO Council, immediate countermeasures were agreed upon, but it was decided to confine retaliations to Africa and not to use nuclear weapons unless Russia did so first. The British left, which had come into being after the Labour Party had split, withdrew from the House of Commons in protest, and the workers of the largest motorworks in Italy assembled outside their long-closed factory to call for strike action. By mid-December, the war in Africa had settled down to a stalemate. There was a good deal of patrolling. The opposing armies lived off the land. In other words, on what game they could bag before the other side got it. Food finding became more important than fighting, and hunger closed the eyes of higher command to proximity of the enemy, except, of course, when the enemy was engaged in tracking the same game. Reports from the front recorded these patrol skirmishes and gave account of the really violent artillery duels. Loading and firing guns required less waning energy than infantry slogging in the heavy country. The fact that the wide no-man's land between the opposing armies formed the main hunting ground exposed friend and foe to the same gunfire. Casualties were consequently high. The Neutral Investigating Commission, appointed after much vetoing by the United Nations, it consisted of delegates from Costa Rica, Kashmir,
and Monaco, found the situation rather confusing and withdrew to Caen to consider its findings. Early in January, a British scientist invented a very high-frequency lamp, regular exposure to which substituted a certain amount of the energy normally absorbed in food. The equipment was fantastically expensive to produce and was therefore available to very few people. A portable, cheaper, and far less efficient model was mass-produced for the armed forces and essential workers. The dashing victories in Africa, forecast by enthusiastic politicians as a certain result of the new machine, did not, however, materialize. The new energy induced in picked units was expended in a redoubled quest for food. The papers reported increased patrol activity. An agent planted by the Communists in the Ministry of Defence in London succeeded in photographing the plans of the ray lamp. Within 6 weeks, a Russian version of the equipment reached the Red Forces in Africa. As a result, the stalemate became staler still. Both sides began to lose control of their troops, which scattered over wide areas of Africa well outside the zone of battle. Game had become scarce, and pursuit led both sides further and further afield. On a swampy peninsula, formed by a hairpin bend of a crocodile-infested river, a British and a French soldier had established their laager. They had joined forces to hunt for edible snakes, and a few hundred yards upriver one of them had trodden on a carelessly buried anti-personnel mine. The soggy ground had prevented the contraption from jumping as high as the designer had intended, and the dense, though leafless undergrowth had screened them from the worst of the blast. They took it in turns to fetch water in the hats from the river, and to bathe each other's wounds. Starving and feverish, neither of them knew for certain when the stranger joined them. He was not in uniform. He spoke English and French so well that they both claimed him for a fellow countryman. He did not enlighten them, and they did not persist in their questions. He insisted on nursing them and waiting on them. He fetched water for them from the river, and he put clay from the river bank on their septic wounds. He said it would heal them. The Englishman was embarrassed to see that the stranger had tears in his eyes while he did it. To pretend that he had not noticed, the Tommy talked about the flipping bastards who strew flipping mines all over the flipping place. The stranger smiled at that, and said he would try to get them some fish from the river. He was away a long time, and when the Englishman crawled down to the river to see what had happened, he saw the stranger on his knees on the river bank. He wanted to shout that one could not catch flippin' fish that flippin' way, but then he changed his mind and crawled back to the Frenchman. The stranger turned up a little later with his hat full of fine fish. He wanted to light a fire to cook them, but the Frenchman pointed up to where shells from both sides were hissing over them, and they ate the fish raw. It tasted wonderful. The stranger settled down to stay with them, and brought fish and water as often as they felt hungry or thirsty. When it was not otherwise engaged, he used one of their bayonets to whittle away at pieces of wood. Their wounds were clearing up fast and did not hurt any more. The Frenchman insisted on giving the stranger his gascape to sleep in, because he had nothing else, and the Tommy pulled out his only spare pair of socks, because the strangers were walked to shreds. Sometimes the stranger left them for a few days, but he always made sure that they had enough water and fish before he left. He came back dusty and dirty and tired out, but he did not seem to need much sleep. Once, when the Tommy woke in the middle of the night and wanted a drink, he saw the stranger kneeling under a nearby tree. Flipping shell shock, probably, poor bastard. The Russian soldier stumbled into their laager one evening just as they were getting ready for sleep. He dropped his rifle in his surprise, and then held his hands up high because the Frenchman was groping for his bayonet. They stood for a while looking at each other until the Frenchman put his weapon down and the Russian's arms fell slowly to his sides. He watched them for a few minutes, Then he saw a fish tail lying on the ground, and picked it up and began to gnaw it. The Tommy glanced at his companions and crawled to the hole in the rocks behind them where they kept their supplies, and gave the Russian a whole fish. The Russian grinned and took it, and while he was eating it, he sat down and gradually wriggled his way closer to them. They showed him another fish, and he said "Da," and they gave it to him. "First time I knew a flippin' Ivan could say yes to," the Tommies said. To their amazement, the stranger spoke to the Russian with the same ease with which he spoke English and French. The Russian spent the night with them, and in the morning, after more fish, he wandered off. He came back dragging mounds of branches with which he built a shelter for the wounded men under one tree, and another one for the stranger. He grinned all over his broad face, pointed to the fish, to them, to himself, and to the shelters. Then he shook hands all around. That afternoon, a Russian fighting patrol passed close by. The officer heard their voices, crept up behind them, and threw a hand grenade among them. The stranger threw himself on top of it just as it went off. The Englishman shot the officer through the head before the dust and smoke had cleared, and the remainder of the patrol withdrew. When they turned the stranger over, the ants were already swarming in his blood. At first they tried to brush them off with twigs, but more and more ants came. The Russian pointed to the river and gestured that it would be kindest to throw the body in. The Frenchman shook his head, and the Englishman started to drag the body to the hole in the rocks. They laid the stranger inside and rolled a rock against the entrance and sealed the gaps with clay. They missed him a great deal, not only because of the fish and water. Next day the Russian left them. Before going, he banged them on the back and shook hands with them several times, and tears left streaks on his dirty face. She was overjoyed to have a son back with her. She could not stop looking at him for the sheer joy of it. "Was it very terrible?" she asked. "No," he smiled at her. "In a way, it was wonderful." "But the suffering and the killing," she said. "I saw more than that," he said. "Did you tell him all of it?" she asked. "All of it." He picked up his knife and whittled away at the wood. "And?" she insisted. "He's angry and sad, and at the same time he's pleased," he said. And that was all he would tell her. But she felt comforted, and she knew it was going to be all right. He shaved the last of the bark of the wood, and looked at the grain, and set to work. This time it would be a child, with fat round cheeks and the dimples of laughter in them. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. The Sons of Japheth by Richard Wilson, originally published in Infinity, December 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Pilot Officer Roy Vangen happened to be spaceborne when the Earth exploded. In that way, he escaped the annihilation along with one other man, revered old Dr. Garfield Garr, who was in the space station. Roy had backed well off in preparation for a Mark 10 dive on Kabul, which the enemy had lately taken over. He had one small omnibon left in his racks, and Kabul had seemed to be about the right size. But then the destruction of Earth changed his plans. He watched, expressionless, as the planet exploded. He shrugged. There was nothing to do now but go see Dr. Garr. Roy's phoscope clamoured insistently, and he tensed, thinking a spaceborne enemy was on him. But it was only a piece of exploding Earth stumbling by. Dr. Garr was alone in the space station because all able-bodied men had been called to fight World War V. The governments of Earth, in a rare moment of conscience during the short truce, had agreed that Dr. Garr, as the embodiment of all earthly knowledge, should be protected from harm. Pilot Officer Roy Vanjan didn't receive as warm a reception from old Dr. Garr as he might have, considering that they were the only two people left. The old man was combing his white beard with his fingers and didn't offer to shake hands. "Well," said Roy as he defused his bomb and secured his single-seater in the space lock, "I guess it's all over." "Scarcely a historic statement," Dr. Garr said, "but it describes the situation." "If you don't have anything for me to do, I'd just as soon have a drink. They usually let me have a stiff one after I complete a mission." Dr. Garr examined the hard young pilot from under shaggy white eyebrows. "I do have another mission for you, but you can have a drink first. Peach brandy is all that's left." "That'll be fine," Roy said. "I was never particular." "Then you're my man," Dr. Garr said, giving him a deep look, "because I want you to go back in time and destroy humanity." "Whatever you say," Roy's training showed. "But if I may comment, wouldn't that be superfluous? Except for you and me, the human race is finished. We've achieved our objective." He spoke without irony. "Never my objective." "I'm not a scholar, and I mean no offence," Roy said, "but I believe it was the coordinated spatial theory you announced back in '06 that made it possible." "Misapplication," Dr. Garr said wearily, not wanting to go into it further for such an audience, though, he thought, he'd never have another. "Come into my study and have your brandy." "I still don't understand," Roy said later. He reached tentatively for the bottle. When the old man made no objection, he poured a second stiff one. "You want me to go back in time and wipe out all human life," Roy said. "I assume you'll tell me when and where. All right? That would destroy our ancestors, and so we'd cease to exist too. Wouldn't it be simpler to kill ourselves now? That is, if you see no point to our further existence." Old Dr. Garr watched the other remnant of earthly life twirl the brandy in the goblet. He looked at the view screen. It showed a panorama of rock dust and steam where Earth had been. "You forget that we have annihilated everything," Dr. Garr said, gazing pensively at the screen. "Mankind, the animals, plant life, and the tiny things that creep the earth or swim the waters. Your mission will be more selective." "Selective? How?" "You'll destroy man, but the rest will live. They may evolve into something better." "If you say so, Doctor." Roy's devotion to duty was a well-worn path. "Assuming you have the machine and I can operate it." "The machine is merely an attachment. It will plug into the instrument panel of your spacecraft. It operates automatically." "Good enough. You always were a whiz at these things. How far back do I go, and who do I kill?" "I want you to strafe the Ark, exercising care not to hurt any of the animals," said old Dr. Garfield Garr. "Noah's Ark?" Pilot Officer Roy Vanjan asked. "You mean during the flood?" "Yes, I've computed it exactly. You won't have to worry about getting there at the wrong time." "You mean after the 40 days' rain, so I'll have good visibility?" "Goodo." He agreed readily, and he'd do as the doctor said, of course, but he permitted a trace of scepticism in his inflection and a searching look into his goblet. "No, not the 40th day," Dr. Garr said, "but in what we are told was the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month. The animals need dry land. I have it all figured out." "I hope so. I mean, I'm sure you have. You're the doctor, of course, but wasn't there some doubt about the accuracy of the old book? I didn't know you were a fundamentalist." "Am I not the repository of all human knowledge?" Dr. Garr asked. He was not a bit angry with Roy Vanjan. "Am I not the last best hope? Has not all else failed us?" "Well, sure. Did not the Noahic covenant, under which human government was established, fail? Has not Japhetic science been our undoing? Roy looked lost. I'm no scholar, Doctor. Agreed. Perhaps you'll grant that I am. He looked with supreme calm at the young pilot. I'm your new intelligence officer, and you're merely my striking arm. Help yourself to another brandy, son. Maybe I'd better not. I don't want to goof the mission. There's time. You'll want some sleep first. All right. I suppose I'll need a steady hand to murder Noah and the rest. And Shem, and Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife, said Dr. Carr, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, as it was written, especially Japheth. But not the animals, remember? I understand that. If you think the 10 Commandments don't apply, whichever one of them it was. They were an element of the Mosaic covenant. It, too, failed. Perhaps the Garrick covenant, if I may be so vain, will endure. The waters covered the earth. A moment ago, before he activated the attachment, Pilot Officer Roy Vangeon's spacecraft had been plunging toward the vortex of a ragged ball of dust and vapor, the destroyed Earth of World War V. Now, in the Adamic year 601, or was it the Edenic? He couldn't remember, though Dr. Garr had let him study the book. The waters stretched everywhere. Ahead the sun glinted in reflection from something rising above the surface. Ararat? He made out the twin peaks. He throttled back to scarcely more than Mach 1 and flew over them high. His second pass took him back along his own vapor trail. This time he spotted the tiny surface craft making for the solitary bit of land. He had to hand it to Dr. Garr. The old boy's space-time grid had hit it right on the button. Roy was too high to distinguish details, but he imagined that Noah and his family would be on deck, full of the wonder of Mount Ararat rising, as promised, from the sea. But there was another wonder. The vapor trails that stretched for miles across the upper air. Did they, down there on the ark, think them a sign of the Lord? Roy smiled ironically. They were the sign of the Lord Garr and of his servant, Pilot Officer Vangeon, come to blast them into eternity and change the future, to give the animals a chance. Who would chronicle his role as a rearranging angel, the unheavenly host about to gather up in violence the drifting souls below? Who, he wondered, some simian scribe, some unborn elephant prophet, an insected scholar destined to evolve from among the creeping things that would inherit the earth? Or perhaps the written word would die unborn under the fiery hail of his guns. No matter. These questions and more had been anticipated by Dr. Garr. Soon now, at the end of Roy's strafing run, it would be up to history to begin assembling the answers. He slowed to Mach minus and set out wings. He would have to dip close to see if the entire Ark's complement was on deck. The job had to be done right, or Earth was kaput. Nothing personal, Noah, old boy. There they were, on the starboard side of the top deck, well out from under the pitch of the roof, craning their necks for a look at this miracle in the sky where they had expected to see only a returning dove. "Behold," Roy cried out, "I bring you tidings, but not the tidings of the dove. I am a lost raven returned, the raven of death. My tidings are of the new future which your descendants will not know, and so will not doom." The frightened, upturned faces were far behind, and he was talking to himself. "Hear me, Noah, for I am come to destroy you, and with you your seeds of self-destruction. These are the tidings I bring from the future that has ceased to exist because you existed, the future that will exist once more when you cease to." He heeled the spacecraft over and back. No more speeches, he told himself, though he had studied the book in fascination. He was a killer, not a philosopher. he would have to make his strafing run low. If he dived on his target, his bullets would go into the holes and kill the animals. He roared at the ark a few feet above the waves. They were all together in a clump, the 8 of them. "Farewell, Noah," he thought, as his thumbs pressed on the death-dealing button. "Farewell, Noah and Noah's wife. Farewell, Ham and Ham's wife and unborn sons. Farewell, Canaan and Cush and Mizraim and Phut. Farewell, Shem and unborn Elam and Ashur and Arphaxad and Lud and Aram. And farewell, Japheth, father of sons of science. Farewell, Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tiras. Farewell, all tribes. Make way for the animal kingdom in the Garrick covenant." He had made 3 passes, and now he zoomed into the sky. He had destroyed humanity and changed the future. Or had he? He'd be dead too if he had, gone like the snap of a finger with the last gasp from the ark. He had killed his ancestors. He had killed everybody's ancestors, but he existed still. Where was the paradox that Dr. Garr had overlooked? The ark had drifted closer to the shore. He circled it and counted the lifeless bodies lying in red stains on the gopher wood of the deck. 8. Then he noticed the change. The backs of his hands were hairier. His shoes were binding him. When he kicked them off, his agile toes curled comfortably around the control pedals. He had a glimpse of a hairy, flat-nosed face reflected in the instrument panel. It laughed, and the sound came out a simian yap. But for all that, he was still a sentient being. His control of the spacecraft was as expert as before. It hadn't worked. "Do you hear, Dr. Garr?" he thought. "It's a flop. I goofed the mission. We're all dead no matter what." "I give you a new commandment, man who would be God. Thou shalt not tamper with time." He had changed the future, and in the future he himself had been changed, but not enough. Somewhere below in the hold of the ark were his ancestors who had evolved along a new path in the new future. The evolution had been slower, perhaps, but it had been as sure, external appearances notwithstanding. Somewhere in the far new future, he was sure, there was a simian Dr. Garr looking down in solitude on the remains of Earth. The ark had touched the land. The animals, his fellow creatures, were beginning to go forth, 2 by 2, onto the shore of Ararat. His phoscope set up a clamour. There in the sky was a new thing, a spacecraft like his, yet unlike it. It looked deadlier, more purposeful. Ignoring him, it was diving out of the unknowable future to destroy its own past. He watched in professional admiration as his fellow pilots screamed unerringly for the ark in sacrificial completion of the mission he himself had failed to accomplish. Death to the animals, too, from an animal pilot. He knew then that Earth would not die. It might circle lifeless for eons, waiting to welcome the foot or paw or tentacle of others from outside. But it would be there, intact and serene. Even as the mountain-shattering explosion came, and he himself ceased to exist, he knew.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Mr. Andrews by E. M. Forster. Originally published in the Open Window Volume 2, 1911. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The souls of the dead were ascending towards the judgment seat and the gate of heaven. The world soul pressed them on every side, just as the atmosphere presses upon rising bubbles, striving to vanquish them, to break their thin envelope of personality, to mingle their virtue with its own. But they resisted, remembering their glorious individual life on earth and hoping for an individual life to come. Among them ascended the soul of a Mr. Andrews who, after a beneficent and honourable life, had recently deceased at his house in town. He knew himself to be kind, upright, and religious, and though he approached his trial with all humility, he could not be doubtful of its result. God was not now a jealous God. He would not deny salvation merely because it was expected. A righteous soul may reasonably be conscious of its own righteousness, and Mr. Andrews was conscious of his. "The way is long," said a voice, "but by pleasant converse the way becomes shorter. Might I travel in your company?" "Willingly," said Mr. Andrews. He held out his hand, and the two souls floated upwards together. "I was slain fighting the infidel," said the other exultantly, "and I go straight to those joys of which the prophet speaks." "Are you not a Christian?" asked Mr. Andrews gravely. "No, I am a believer, but you are a Muslim, surely." "I am not," said Mr. Andrews. "I am a believer." The two souls floated upwards in silence, but did not release each other's hands. "I am Broad Church," he added gently. The word broad quavered strangely amid the interspaces. "Relate to me your career," said the Turk at last. "I was born of a decent middle-class family, and had my education at Winchester and Oxford. I thought of becoming a missionary, but was offered a post in the Board of Trade, which I accepted. At 32 I married, and had 4 children, 2 of whom have died. My wife survives me. If I had lived a little longer, I should have been knighted. Now I will relate my career. I was never sure of my father, and my mother does not signify. I grew up in the slums of Salonika, when I joined a band and we plundered the villages of the infidel. I prospered and had 3 wives, all of whom survive me. Had I lived a little longer, I should have had a band of my own. A son of mine was killed travelling in Macedonia. Perhaps you killed him." "It is very possible." The two souls floated upward, hand in hand. Mr. Andrews did not speak again, for he was filled with horror at the approaching tragedy. This man, so godless, so lawless, so cruel, so lustful, believed that he would be admitted into heaven. And into what a heaven? A place full of the crude pleasures of a ruffian's life on earth? But Mr. Andrews felt neither disgust nor moral indignation. He was only conscious of an immense pity, and his own virtues confronted him not at all. He longed to save the man whose hand he held more tightly, who, he thought, was now holding more tightly on to him. And when he reached the gate of heaven, instead of saying, "Can I enter?" as he had intended, he cried out, "Cannot he enter?" And at the same moment the Turk uttered the same cry, for the same spirit was working in each of them. From the gateway a voice replied, "Both can enter." They were filled with joy and pressed forward together. Then the voice said, "In what clothes will you enter?" "In my best clothes," shouted the Turk,
the ones I stole." And he clad himself in a splendid turban and a waistcoat embroidered with silver, and baggy trousers, and a great belt in which were stuck pipes and pistols and knives. "And in what clothes will you enter?" said the voice to Mr. Andrews. Mr. Andrews thought of his best clothes, but he had no wish to wear them again. At last he remembered and said, "Robes." "Of what colour and fashion?" asked the voice. Mr. Andrews had never thought about the matter much. He replied in hesitating tones, "White, I suppose, of some flowing soft material." And he was immediately given a garment such as he had described. "Do I wear it rightly?" he asked. "Wear it as it pleases you," replied the voice. "What else do you desire?" "A harp," suggested Mr. Andrews. "A small one." A small gold harp was placed in his hand. "And a palm." "No, I cannot have a palm, for it is the reward of martyrdom. My life has been tranquil and happy." "You can have a palm if you desire it." But Mr. Andrews refused the palm, and hurried in his white robes after the Turk who had already entered heaven. As he passed in at the open gate, a man, dressed like himself, passed out with gestures of despair. "Why is he not happy?" he asked. The voice did not reply. "And who are all those figures seated inside on thrones in mountains? Why are some of them terrible and sad and ugly?" There was no answer. Mr. Andrews entered, and then he saw that those seated figures were all the gods who were then being worshipped on the earth. A group of souls stood round each, singing his praises, but the gods paid no heed, for they were listening to the prayers of living men, which alone brought them nourishment. Sometimes a faith would grow weak, and then the god of that faith also drooped and dwindled and fainted for his daily portion of incense. And sometimes, owing to a revivalist movement, or to a great commemoration, or to some other cause, a faith would grow strong, and the god of that faith grow strong also. And more frequently still, a faith would alter, so that the features of its god altered and became contradictory, and passed from ecstasy to respectability, or from mildness and universal love to the ferocity of battle. And at times a god would divide into 2 gods, or 3, or more, each with his own ritual and precarious supply of prayer. Mr. Andrews saw Buddha and Vishnu and Allah and Jehovah and the Elohim. He saw little ugly determined gods who were worshipped by a few savages in the same way. He saw the vast shadowy outlines of the neo-pagan Zeus. There were cruel gods, and coarse gods, and tortured gods, and worse still, there were gods who were peevish, or deceitful, or vulgar. No aspiration of humanity was unfulfilled. There was even an intermediate state for those who wished it, and for the Christian scientists a place where they could demonstrate that they had not died. He did not play his harp for long, but hunted vainly for one of his dead friends, and though souls were continually entering heaven, it still seemed curiously empty. Though he had all that he expected, he was conscious of no great happiness, no mystic contemplation of beauty, no mystic union with good. There was nothing to compare with that moment outside the gate, when he prayed that the Turk might enter and heard the Turk uttering the same prayer for him. And when at last he saw his companion, he hailed him with a cry of human joy. The Turk was seated in thought, and round him, by 7s, sat the virgins who are promised in the Koran. "Oh, my dear friend," he called out, "come here, and we will never be parted, and such as my pleasures are, they shall be yours also. Where are my other friends? Where are the men whom I love, or whom I have killed?"
"I, too, have only found you," said Mr. Andrews. He sat down by the Turk, and the virgins, who were all exactly alike, ogled them with coal-black eyes.
"Though I have all that I expected," said the Turk, "I am conscious of no great happiness. There is nothing to compare with that moment outside the gate when I prayed that you might enter, and heard you uttering the same prayer for me. These virgins are as beautiful and good as I had fashioned, yet I could wish that they were better."
As he wished, the forms of the virgins became more rounded, and their eyes grew larger and blacker than before. And Mr. Andrews, by a wish similar in kind, increased the purity and softness of his garment and the glitter of his harp. For in that place their expectations were fulfilled, but not their hopes. "I am going," said Mr. Andrews at last. "We desire infinity, and we cannot imagine it. How can we expect it to be granted? I have never imagined anything infinitely good or beautiful, excepting in my dreams."
"I am going with you," said the other.
Together they sought the entrance gate, and the Turk parted with his virgins and his best clothes, and Mr. Andrews cast away his robes and his harp. "Can we depart?" they asked. "You can both depart if you wish," said the voice, "but remember what lies outside." As soon as they passed the gate, they felt again the pressure of the world soul. For a moment they stood hand in hand resisting it. Then they suffered it to break in upon them, and they, and all the experience they had gained, and all the love and wisdom they had generated, passed into it, and made it better. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. From the pages of dusty old pulp magazines to your ear.